What is going on, good people? So installing the Ironcutter Bermuda could be the single best decision that you can make for your lawn to achieve the look that you're looking for, have less maintenance, and also spend less money. So who doesn't want to have a better looking lawn, spend less effort doing it, and also spend less money to achieve that? Let's talk about it in this video. So let's start by talking about why Ironcutter Bermuda. So Ironcutter is produced by MVP Genetics, which is under the same family with MVS or Mountain View Seed, which produces the cool season grass cultivars that you all know that I love. So Ironcutter has a couple of features that takes it a step up from the cultivars that are currently out on the market. So one of those being improved cold tolerance. Ironcutter has been grown in some of the locations in the US almost up to Canada, so far north in New York. I know some people that have installed it there and it is growing well and thriving. Given it does go dormant pretty soon, but when it is in its growing season, it does pretty well. The improved cold tolerance, also the improved drought resistance. And when you look at Ironcutter, one of the benefits that I enjoy about it is it has a naturally darker green color than most of the Bermuda cultivars that are currently out on the market, without you having to apply a lot of extra product or fertilizer or anything to get that color that you're looking for. Once it is fully established, you can count on it having a full and dense canopy. It has a very fine leaf texture, and the leaf texture is very soft on the foot. When you compare that to some of the other Bermuda grasses out on the market, you can definitely tell a difference. Now let's talk about the establishment methods for Ironcutter Bermuda grass or any other Bermuda grass that you may choose. One thing about Ironcutter Bermuda grass, it's a vegetative cultivar. What that means is there is no seed. It can't be grown from seed. It has to be grown from one of these three methods that I'm about to discuss now. So the first method is by side. So you can install a brand new lawn with side, and the best thing about that is you instantly have a green lawn. Yeah, you've got to water it and make sure it roots down and established, but for the most part, by the time it's installed, you have a lawn that is there and existing. But that also comes at a cost, which is typically a higher expense for the convenience of that instant lawn. The second method is using plugs. So I think the best use of this method is actually for small patch repair areas or really small areas that you can spread out a number of plugs throughout that area, plug those in from existing growing Bermuda grass into the desired area. And then that Bermuda grass will start to spread once it's established and fill in all of those areas that you wanted to get covered with the Ironcutter or whatever Bermuda grass that you decide on. The third method, and also the method that we used at Pop's to establish his lawn from this renovation, is actually from Sprigs. So Sprigs are pieces of rhizomes and stolons and roots from an existing Bermuda grass stand, typically at the turf farm, and you take those, you harvest them off of those existing fields, and you go and you install them in wherever your desired location is for your new Bermuda grass. And the thing is, this is a pretty simple method, and it is also typically the most cost-effective method for establishing a large scale or a medium-sized lawn to be able to get a high-quality cultivar and also to kind of reduce some of the expense of not installing a full lawn with side. So now to talk about how we installed the Ironcutter Bermuda grass at my Pops in North Carolina. So first off, Sprigs are actually sold in bushels. You would go to a side farm that actually has an iron cutter established and has sprigs for sale, and you would buy those by the bushel. So we had a 20,000 square foot renovation that we had to complete, and we used 400 bushels of Bermudagrass sprigs to cover this area. So the more sprigs that you use, or the more bushels of sprigs that you use for your area, the quicker that it will establish and fill in. But the downside of that is that's increased cost because you're purchasing more bushels of those sprigs. So probably the most important thing with installing Bermuda grass from Sprigs is going to be the time from harvest to the time of installation and water getting applied to those new sprigs. So you want to reduce that time as much as possible and get those sprigs on the ground as quickly as possible after they are harvested. So the longer that duration goes on, the more potential for die-off that you have from the sprigs that were harvested from the side farm, which then reduces the chances of success in your renovation. So the original plan or method for installing these sprigs and get them spread out across my pop's lawn was to actually use a straw blower that we rented. It actually worked out pretty good at the beginning when we made the first trials, but we later found out that was because the sprigs that were on the top of the super sack bags that we had were a little more dry than the ones that were in the middle and towards the bottom. So as we used the sprigs that were in the middle and the bottoms of the bag, they tend to clump up and they didn't spread well through the straw blower. So I think this method would have worked if we had dried out or allowed the sprigs to dry out a little more before we ran them through the straw blower to actually help spread them across the lawn. The only downside to that is that's probably one things that you don't want to do to sprigs is to dry them out. So at the end of the day, what do you go to? Good old manual spreading of the sprigs, which is really typically the most common way of spreading sprigs. I've seen it at golf courses, I've seen it in a number of landscapers, that this is really the method that they use when they don't have large equipment or have an area that they can get large sprigging equipment in. So when you're sprigging large fields or fairways, there is equipment that's able to sprig those. But when you're talking about a 4,000, 5,000, 10,000, even 20,000 square foot lawn, sometimes you're not able to get that large equipment on those lawns, and you kind of revert back to a manual process of just spreading those sprigs out, which is really similar to spreading seed. Is just not as easy as pushing a broadcast spreader across the lawn. The day that we did this, it wasn't very hot, but it was also June in North Carolina, so it was pretty warm outside. So as soon as we would get a section done, immediately we would turn on the irrigation and soak down that area as we were moving on to the next section. So getting water on these sprigs once they have been applied to your area is probably the #1 thing to improve your success rate. So once we had the full 20,000 square feet covered with the sprigs, we've watered all of the sections. The next thing that we did is we came back with a lawn roller and rolled all of those sprigs in. Very similar to seed to soil contact, we were looking for sprig to soil contact. So you want to get those sprigs pressed into the ground so they can begin to root very easily into the soil. So once that was completed, all of the hardest part of the work was all behind us, and there were better days of a green lawn that would be coming in the future. So up to this point, there was a lot of labor, a lot of effort that went into it. But as you'll see later in this video, it all paid off. Now that we have the sprigs on the lawn, just as with seed, the most important thing and the most important piece of this process is water. you have to have water. When it comes to watering, you want to keep the soil and the sprigs moist to slightly above moist, more than what you would for seed, but you want to make sure that you're keeping adequate moisture in the soil and also to the sprigs. So you'll want to keep up this watering for about 3 to 4 weeks, depending on what your conditions are and how the sprigs are starting to establish. But you want to make sure you're continuing to keep moisture throughout that duration. So for this area at my pops, it was full sun. So there was very little shade relief to help hold any of that moisture. So we were watering about 5 to 6 times per day to make sure everything was staying slightly above moist. So once you start to see those sprigs starting to green back up, you see new grass blades, you see new stolons, that is a critical turning point of knowing that you now have establishment of those sprigs and your future lawn is on its way. But even throughout this process, make sure you keep everything moist. That is the critical thing with getting sprigs to establish, similar to with seed, but it requires just a little bit more water than when you're establishing seed. Now that you've got your water all dialed in, now comes the part in the process where it's time for you to have some patience and trust the process. I know this is gonna be hard. I think this is probably worse than actually growing seed, because around the 10-day mark, things are going to look pretty bad. More than likely, they will. Around that 10-day mark, everything looked like it was completely brown and completely dead. I've talked to other people and that's about the same results that they saw around that time point. But then shortly after you get past that and you get to around that 3-week mark or 21 days, things are really starting to look like, hey, I may actually have a lawn in a couple more weeks. So during that process, continue to water, stay consistent with your watering, and hopefully you're getting some natural rain to help you out along the way, because there's nothing like the rain that comes from above when it's either germinating seed or establishing sprigs. So be patient. It will be okay, because once we got past that 3-week mark where we actually put the first cut and fertilization on it, and we'll talk about fertilization here in a minute, things really started to change. And by the 6-week mark, yeah, we looked like we had a lawn. Things were almost filled in, still had some spots that were coming in slowly, but even in time, those areas will continue to fill in. And around this 4 to 5 week mark is the time where mowing is your friend. You want to make sure that you're mowing it frequently, at least 2 to 3 times per week, to encourage that growth and to encourage that Bermuda grass to fill in. So you haven't had a lawn to mow in a long time. Now is the time for you to make sure that you're getting out there, you're mowing it and you're enjoying it as it starts to fill in and you start to get more density and coverage. So once we reached about the 9-week mark, the lawn was for the most part fully filled in. Within 9 weeks, we were able to go from bare ground, install the sprigs, and then we had a fully established lawn. Given it is still young, but it was rooted, green, lush, growing, and everything else. You may have a couple of areas in some spots that were still filling in, but I would say that we were 98% filled in, with a couple of areas here and there that still needed some time for them to fill in, which eventually they did. So fertilization is going to also be another critical item for establishing this new Bermuda grass stand. And it doesn't have to be very complicated. Actually, we went with a fairly simple method of fertilization. Nothing fancy, we just got it down and got the plant what it needed. So at the time of sprigging, no fertilization was done. We didn't apply anything except for water during the time of sprigging. Once we got about 3 weeks in and we had those sprigs starting to get established, we started to see that green up. That's when we were ready to put out some fertilizer, because now there are roots in the soil that's now able to take up those nutrients that you're applying from the fertilizer. So we kept it very simple. Every 3 to 4 weeks, we went down with either 3/4 or a pound of nitrogen, mostly from a quick release source. During this period of time, you want to be able to get that nitrogen into the plant quickly. So throughout this establishment period, we stopped our last fertilization. Early September is when we cut it off and kept it very simple, just a fertilizer from the local turf supply store. During this establishment process, it's inevitable that you're gonna have some weeds that are going to come up. It's warm outside, you're applying moisture, weeds are going to want to grow. You're creating the environment for them to grow. So with my pop's lawn, even though we did a full renovation and we had multiple applications of herbicide to eliminate the existing lawn and weeds, this lawn had never had a pre-emergent applied to it, and it was very weedy prior to this renovation. So I knew the seed bank of weed seeds in the soil was gonna be pretty heavy. And that's pretty much what we experienced. So around the 5-week mark is where you can start to apply your common warm season grass herbicides to your Ironcutter Bermudagrass renovation. So any of those could be Certainty, Celsius, or Speed Zone for southern lawns. Those are some pretty common ones that are safe to be able to use around that 5-week mark with very little impact to your renovation. So this covers all the processes, all the steps, everything that we did to establish my dad's elite Ironcutter Bermudagrass from MVP Genetics. I can say that we are more than satisfied with this. Think about going with Ironcutter Bermudagrass because I have zero complaints about choosing that cultivar. All right, y'all, as I always say, just know we working.